Hello, everybody. I'm Seth Weissman, and welcome to another episode of Safe Real Estate. Today, we are going to talk about some changes GAR is going to be making to its forms to comply with new guidance that we have received from the National Association of REALTORS. And unfortunately, that guidance has to do with compensation of the buyer broker. And you know, one of the challenges with the NAR settlement is that it is written in very general terms. And as a result, different lawyers, brokers, and others have interpreted it in different ways. And as NAR has tried to settle the case that's been brought against it, I think NAR's position may be growing a little more cautious and conservative than where it was even a few months ago. So let's take a look at what the actual words are in the settlement regarding compensation. And there are basically three things that the settlement says. The first thing is the settlement requires that all realtors working with a buyer enter into a written agreement before the buyer tours any homes. And obviously, this is a requirement that we are all familiar with. You have to have a written agreement. The second obligation is that the amount of compensation reflected must be objectively ascertainable and may not be open-ended. And actually, the settlement goes on to say, as an example of something which is open-ended, that buyer's broker's compensation shall be whatever amount the seller is offering to the buyer. That would be an example of something that is open-ended. And when I look up the dictionary definition of open-ended, it basically means something without limits. The third requirement regarding compensation is as follows. The realtor may not receive compensation for brokerage services from any source that exceeds the amount or rate agreed to in the agreement with the buyer. In other words, what that is saying is that the total compensation of the buyer broker must be approved by the buyer. Now, with that as background, let's take the following example. Let's say that the buyer doesn't really have money to pay the buyer's broker, but the buyer says, I will pay you one lollipop, or I'll pay you $1, but I give you permission to collect a specific compensation from the seller in the following amount: 3 lollipops, 5 lollipops, 20 lollipops. In other words, the buyer in that instance would be paying a small amount, but would be giving permission to the buyer's broker to get a much larger amount from the seller or the seller's broker. What NAR is saying now is that they don't see that as being compliant with the NAR settlement, because they're saying there's no guarantee that the buyer's broker will receive whatever amount they are allowed to try to negotiate for, and that as a result, the amount of compensation that is actually going to be paid to the buyer's broker is not readily ascertainable. While I have a different view of it, at the end of the day, as members of the Georgia Association of REALTORS and the National Association of REALTORS, we have to go with NAR's interpretation of the settlement. And what the National Association of REALTORS is saying is that the only way to fully comply is for the buyer to be obligated initially to pay the buyer's broker's entire compensation. So if the buyer's broker is charging 5 lollipops, the buyer must be on the hook for 5 lollipops. Now, it is possible for the buyer's broker to negotiate with the seller and for the seller or seller's broker to then agree to pay all or a portion of the compensation obligation of the buyer. But if for some reason the seller or seller's broker are not willing to pay a dime, NAR is saying the buyer must be obligated to pay any amount not paid for by the seller or seller's broker. The other clarification that NAR has made is that if the seller or seller's broker agree to pay some part of the buyer broker's commission, that any amount they pay must reduce the obligation of the buyers. So GAR, the Georgia Association of REALTORS, is going to be amending its forms beginning on January 1st to reflect that. Now, I wish we didn't have to make these changes, but the reality is I suspect that over the next year or so, this is probably going to be a continuing, evolving process, and there may be some other changes that we will have to make as realtors. But as always, we'll make whatever adjustments are needed, we'll move on, and we'll continue with our businesses. It's great to see everybody. I hope this episode of Safe Real Estate has been beneficial. Please continue to tune in. Bye now.